I refused to let HOA officers enter my private property, but they never expected me to reveal the ownership records proving my land was not part of the HOA. Their authority disappeared when the truth came out. Welcome back, everyone. Before today's story begins, I want to thank each and every one of you for being here. If this is your first time on the channel, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you'll always know when a new story is released. Your support means more than you know. Every like, comment, and subscription helps this channel grow and allows us to keep sharing incredible stories with viewers around the world. And before we begin, tell me this: where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories travel. Now, grab a comfortable seat, relax, and let's dive into today's unforgettable story. The first sign that something was wrong was not the knock on my gate. It was the confidence in the voice on the other side, as if they already owned the answer before asking the question. My name is Nathan Caldwell, and before that afternoon, I never imagined a simple conversation at my property entrance would turn into a battle over something so basic: ownership. For years, my land at Pine Ridge Valley had been my quiet place away from the noise of everyday life. It was not part of a crowded neighborhood. It was not a place where strangers could simply walk in and make decisions for me. I purchased the property years before the surrounding area developed into what people now call the community. The land had history. The boundaries were clear. The records were documented. And most importantly, I knew exactly what I owned. That was why the afternoon started like any other. I was standing near the front gate, reviewing plans for a small improvement project on my property. The weather was calm. The sound of tools echoed across the yard. Everything felt normal, until I heard vehicles approaching. At first, I assumed it was a delivery or maybe a contractor arriving earlier than expected. But then I saw the logos on the vehicles. HOA. 3 people stepped out. Leading them was Lauren Whitaker, the head officer of Pine Ridge Valley's Homeowners Association. I recognized her. We had spoken briefly before. She always carried herself with confidence. She had the kind of presence that made people listen before she even finished speaking. Lauren walked toward my gate holding a folder. Behind her, 2 other HOA representatives followed. They looked organized, prepared, almost like they had already decided how the conversation would end. "Mr. Caldwell," Lauren said, stopping outside my gate. "We need access to inspect the property." I looked at the gate between us. Then I looked back at her. "Access for what reason?" She seemed surprised by the question. "We are conducting a community compliance review." Her tone suggested the matter was already settled. But I knew something was missing. A reason was not the same as a right. "I'm sorry," I said calmly, "but I can't allow access to my property without proper authorization." The expression on Lauren's face changed slightly. Not anger, more like disbelief. She was not used to hearing no. "You understand this is part of the HOA's responsibility," she replied. I nodded. "I understand what an HOA does. I'm asking what document gives you authority over this property." For a moment, nobody spoke. The 2 officers behind her exchanged a quick glance. Lauren adjusted the folder in her hands. "This community has rules," she said. "And rules require jurisdiction," I answered. That was when I noticed the confidence in her voice beginning to shift. Because she expected resistance. But she did not expect questions. Most people hear the word HOA and assume there is automatic authority. They assume rules apply because someone says they do. But I had learned something important long before that day. Authority is not created by confidence. It is created by legal foundation. Lauren stepped closer to the gate. "Mr. Caldwell, refusing cooperation could create unnecessary problems." It was not a threat. Not exactly. But it was pressure. She wanted me to feel like refusing was unreasonable. Like I was the difficult person. Like the easiest solution was simply opening the gate and letting them do whatever they wanted. But something about the situation felt wrong. The way they arrived. The way they spoke. The certainty that they had the right to enter. They were not asking. They were expecting. And that was the moment I realized this was not about an inspection. It was about whether I would allow someone else to decide what happened on my own property. I placed my hand on the gate and looked directly at Lauren. "I'm not trying to create a conflict," I said. "But this is private property." What Lauren did not know was that I already had the documents proving exactly where my property stood. And when she discovered what those records showed, the entire conversation would change. The easiest way to lose control of a situation is to assume the other person does not know their own rights. Lauren Whitaker made that mistake when she arrived at my gate believing confidence was enough to open it. After I refused access to my property, Lauren did not leave. Instead, she stood there with the same calm expression she had when she first arrived. The kind of expression someone wears when they believe the conversation is already decided. She looked down at her folder, then back at me. "Mr. Caldwell, I think you may be misunderstanding the situation," she said. I stayed quiet, because I was not misunderstanding anything. I understood exactly what was happening. They wanted access. I wanted to know why they believed they had the right to ask for it. Those were two completely different things. Lauren explained that Pine Ridge Valley had standards. She talked about property appearance. She talked about community responsibility. She talked about protecting property values. Every point sounded reasonable on the surface. That was what made situations like this complicated. People often hear words like community and responsibility and assume those words automatically create authority. But they do not. A community can have rules. An organization can have guidelines. But none of those things erase ownership. I looked at the two officers standing behind Lauren. They were waiting. Maybe they expected me to eventually give in. Maybe they believed this was just another homeowner who would rather avoid conflict than challenge the HOA. But they did not know me. I had spent years working with contracts, construction documents, and property records. I knew the difference between someone requesting cooperation and someone claiming power they did not have. "Can you show me the agreement that allows the HOA to access this land?" I asked. Lauren's expression tightened. "We manage this area," she replied. That wasn't my question. For the first time, the confidence in her voice slowed. She looked away briefly, not because she had lost the argument. Not yet, but because she realized I was not going to accept a vague answer. I was asking for something specific. Proof. That was the one thing confidence could not replace. Lauren opened her folder and showed me several HOA documents. I looked through them carefully. There were community rules, maintenance policies, general guidelines, but nothing that clearly gave them control over my property. Nothing that answered the question I had asked. Where was the legal authority? Lauren noticed I was not convinced. "You are making this more difficult than it needs to be," she said. I looked at the gate between us. That gate represented more than a physical boundary. It represented a simple idea. Some things belong to other people, and respecting that boundary is what keeps communities functioning. "I'm not making this difficult," I replied. "I'm asking you to respect the same rules you claim to protect." The silence that followed felt different. The officers behind her stopped looking like they were waiting for me to cooperate. They started looking like they were waiting for Lauren to explain. That was the moment the balance shifted. Not because I raised my voice, not because I threatened anyone, but because I refused to let assumptions replace facts. Lauren finally stepped back from the gate. She told me the HOA board would review the matter. I simply nodded, because I already knew what they would find. The documents existed. The records existed. The truth had been there long before that afternoon. They just had not looked for it. What Lauren did not know was that I had kept every document related to my property since the day I purchased it. And somewhere inside those records was the one piece of information that would completely change this situation. The information that would prove something nobody from the HOA expected. They did not have authority over my land. They never did. The most powerful moment in any argument is not when someone speaks louder. It is when someone places undeniable evidence on the table and lets the truth speak for itself. After Lauren Whitaker and the HOA officers left my property, I walked back toward my house with one thought in my mind. I needed to know exactly what they believed gave them authority. I already had a strong suspicion, but suspicion was not enough. I wanted facts. So that evening, I went through every document connected to my land. The same documents I had collected years earlier when I purchased the property. The same records I kept organized because I knew ownership was not something to take casually. I sat in my office with the files spread across my desk. Outside the window, the sun was disappearing behind the hills of Pine Ridge Valley. Everything looked peaceful, almost too peaceful compared to what had happened earlier. I opened the original purchase agreement, then the property survey, then the official boundary records. Each document confirmed what I already believed. My land was separate. The boundaries were clearly marked. The ownership history was clear. But then I found the document that changed the entire situation. A property classification record from when the surrounding community was developed. I read the information carefully. Then I read it again. There it was. A single section explaining that my property was excluded from the HOA jurisdiction. Not partially included. Not temporarily included. Excluded. I leaned back in my chair and thought about Lauren standing at my gate. The confidence in her voice. The certainty in her words. The assumption that because my property sat near Pine Ridge Valley, the HOA automatically had control. But they had never checked. They saw the location. They saw the surrounding neighborhood. And they assumed ownership of authority they never actually had. The next morning, I contacted the HOA office. I did not call to argue. I did not call to embarrass anyone. I simply requested clarification. I wanted to know whether they had any document showing my property was under their control. Lauren responded later that day. Her message was polite but careful. She said the HOA believed my property was part of the community. But when I asked for the legal documentation supporting that belief, the answer changed. There was no document, only assumptions. That was when I realized the problem was bigger than one visit to my gate. The HOA officers were not acting based on a legal foundation. They were acting based on what they thought was true. And there is a dangerous difference between those two things. A belief can be wrong. A record cannot. A few days later, Lauren requested another meeting. This time, the conversation was different. The confidence was still there, but it was not as strong. She arrived with another board member. They wanted to review the situation directly with me. I invited them to sit down. Then I placed the documents on the table. I watched as they looked through each page. The room became quieter with every document they reviewed. The property survey, the ownership records, the jurisdiction information. Everything pointed to the same conclusion. My land was mine. The HOA had no authority to enter, no authority to inspect, no authority to demand access. Lauren looked at the papers for a long moment. For the first time since she arrived at my gate, she did not have an immediate response. Because the conversation was no longer about opinions. It was no longer about who sounded more confident. It was about what the records proved. And the records proved something the HOA never expected. They were not standing above my property. They were standing outside the boundary of their own authority. The most surprising thing about power is how quickly it disappears when people finally ask one simple question. Where is your proof? After Lauren Whitaker reviewed the documents on my table, the conversation changed completely. A few days earlier, she arrived at my gate with the confidence of someone who believed the outcome was already decided. She expected me to open the gate. She expected me to accept the HOA's authority. She expected the conversation to end the way many similar conversations probably ended before. But this time was different. Because I did not argue with her position, I questioned the foundation behind it. And once the documents were placed in front of her, the entire situation became impossible to ignore. Lauren picked up the property records again. She studied the pages carefully. The other board member beside her leaned closer, reading the same information. The room was quiet except for the sound of paper moving across the table. Those few seconds said more than any argument could. They were not looking for a way to prove they were right anymore. They were trying to understand how they had been wrong. Finally, Lauren looked up. So this property was never part of the HOA? Her voice was different. Not defensive. Not confident. Just uncertain. I nodded. That is what the records show. She looked back down at the documents. The same documents that had existed since the day I bought the land. The same documents that clearly explained the boundaries. The same documents nobody from the HOA had bothered to verify before arriving at my gate. That was the part that bothered me the most. Not that they asked questions. Questions are normal. Communities need communication. The problem was that they came with assumptions instead of information. They believed the location of my property gave them authority. But being surrounded by an HOA community does not automatically make a property part of that HOA. A boundary line does not care about appearances. A legal document does not change because someone makes an assumption. That afternoon, Lauren finally admitted something important. The HOA had never reviewed my original ownership records. They had only relied on a community map, and that map created the misunderstanding. It showed my property near Pine Ridge Valley, but it did not show legal control. That distinction mattered. A person can stand next to something without owning it. An organization can exist around something without controlling it. And an HOA can create rules without having unlimited power. After the meeting, Lauren said the board would need to discuss the issue internally. I agreed, because at that point, I was no longer trying to prove something to one person. The documents had already done that. The bigger question was whether the HOA would recognize the mistake and correct it. Over the next several days, I watched the situation develop. The board contacted their legal advisors. They reviewed old records. They compared community documents with official property information. And slowly, the reality became clear. They had been operating under a misunderstanding for years, not only about my property, but about the limits of their own authority. That was when I realized this situation was bigger than one gate. The gate was only the first visible sign. The real issue was what happened when people stopped checking facts and started relying on assumptions. Because assumptions can create confidence. They can create pressure. They can even make people believe they have power. But assumptions cannot create legal rights. The HOA officers came to my property believing they had the authority to enter. They left knowing they never had that authority at all. And the most important thing they learned was the same thing I had known from the beginning. Ownership is not decided by who speaks the loudest. It is decided by what the records prove. The biggest discoveries are not always hidden in secret places. Sometimes they are found in the documents everyone was too confident to read. After the HOA board finished reviewing my property records, I thought the situation would end there. The facts were clear. My property was never under HOA jurisdiction. The officers had no legal right to demand access. The documents proved everything. But what happened next showed me that the problem was not only about my land. It was about a pattern. A few days after our meeting, I received an invitation to attend the Pine Ridge Valley HOA meeting. The message was professional. The wording was careful. They wanted to discuss recent concerns regarding property boundaries and community procedures. I knew what that meant. They needed to address what happened, not just with me, but with everyone watching. When I arrived at the community center, the atmosphere felt different from previous meetings. People were talking quietly before it started. Some residents recognized me and came over to ask questions. They were not angry. They were curious. They wanted to understand how something like this could happen. That was when I realized many people had never questioned the HOA's authority before. They assumed that if the HOA said something, it must automatically be correct. And that assumption was exactly what created the problem. Lauren Whitaker stood at the front of the room. She looked more serious than I had ever seen her. The confidence was still there, but it was mixed with something else. Caution. She began by explaining that the HOA had discovered a misunderstanding regarding my property. She did not use the word mistake. She did not say the HOA was wrong. She carefully chose every word. But everyone in the room understood what had happened. The documents had spoken, and they had spoken clearly. Then Lauren explained that the board would be reviewing property records more carefully in the future. They would verify boundaries. They would confirm jurisdiction. They would make sure similar situations did not happen again. That was the right direction. But several residents had questions. One homeowner raised his hand. If the HOA was wrong about Nathan's property, how do we know there are not other properties with the same issue? The room became quiet. Because that question was bigger than mine. It was the question everyone had been thinking. Lauren paused before answering. She admitted the board needed to conduct a broader review. That was the first time I saw something change. The HOA officers were no longer standing in front of residents as unquestioned authority. They were answering questions. And that difference mattered. After the meeting, several homeowners spoke with me. Some shared their own experiences. They mentioned situations where they felt decisions were made too quickly. Rules were explained without enough discussion. Questions were sometimes treated as resistance instead of requests for information. None of these situations were exactly like mine, but they shared the same problem. People assumed authority existed without checking where it came from. That was the lesson hidden inside everything that happened. Rules are important. Organizations are important. Communities need structure. But structure without accountability can become something else. It can become control. Over the next month, Pine Ridge Valley began changing. The HOA created clearer procedures. Important decisions required more documentation. Property boundaries were reviewed more carefully. Residents were encouraged to participate. The changes were not dramatic. There were no public arguments. No unnecessary conflict. Just a slow return to something that should have existed from the beginning. Respect. As for Lauren, I noticed a difference in how she approached conversations. She still cared about the community. She still wanted things organized. But she seemed to understand something she had missed before. Leadership does not mean having the ability to enter every door. It means knowing which doors are not yours to open. And that was the moment I realized the real victory was never about keeping the HOA away from my property. The real victory was making sure everyone understood why they needed permission in the first place. The most important changes are not the ones that happen in front of everyone. They are the ones that happen quietly, when people finally understand the difference between having responsibility and having control. After the HOA meeting at Pine Ridge Valley, I expected things to slowly return to normal. But what happened next showed me that the situation had created something much bigger than a disagreement over my property. It had created awareness. Before everything happened, many residents never questioned the HOA's authority. They saw the officers as people responsible for maintaining order. They believed the rules existed for a reason. And most of the time, that was true. A community needs organization. It needs people willing to handle problems. It needs structure. But structure only works when the people enforcing it understand their limits. That was the lesson Pine Ridge Valley had to learn. In the weeks after the meeting, the HOA board continued reviewing their procedures. They examined old records. They checked property boundaries. They compared community maps with official documents. And they discovered something uncomfortable. The issue was not only my property. The misunderstanding had existed because people relied too heavily on assumptions. The HOA map showed areas around Pine Ridge Valley, but a map showing location was not the same as a document showing legal authority. That difference seemed small, but it changed everything. A few weeks later, I attended another HOA meeting. This time, the atmosphere was completely different. There was no tension at the entrance. No officers standing with folders. No assumption that everyone would simply agree. Instead, people came prepared with questions. One homeowner asked about property boundaries. Another asked how HOA jurisdiction was determined. Someone else asked whether residents had ever received clear explanations about the rules affecting their homes. Those questions were important, not because they challenged the HOA, but because they created accountability. And accountability is what keeps any organization healthy. I watched Lauren Whitaker during that meeting. She was still professional. She was still organized. But there was a noticeable difference. Before, she spoke like someone delivering decisions. Now, she spoke like someone explaining them. That change might seem small to some people, but it represented something significant. She was no longer assuming authority. She was recognizing responsibility. After the meeting, Lauren approached me. The conversation was brief. She did not try to defend what happened at my gate. She did not blame the documents. She simply admitted that the HOA should have verified the information before requesting access. That statement mattered, because the biggest problem was never that someone made a mistake. Mistakes happen. The problem was when confidence replaced verification, when assumptions replaced records, when a position became more important than the facts. I told Lauren something I believed from the beginning. I was never against the HOA. A well-run HOA can help create a better community. Rules can protect homeowners. Standards can maintain shared spaces. But those rules have to respect the people they are meant to serve. The HOA exists because homeowners allow it to exist. It does not exist above them. That was the principle everyone needed to remember. Over time, Pine Ridge Valley became a different place. Residents became more involved. Meetings became more open. Questions became normal instead of uncomfortable. And the relationship between homeowners and the HOA became stronger because it was built on something more important than authority: trust. Looking back at the day Lauren stood outside my gate, I realized something. The most important thing I protected was not just my property. It was the idea that ownership matters. Boundaries matter. And every person deserves to know where someone else's authority ends. Because a community becomes stronger when people respect each other's rights. Not when one person believes they have the right to open every gate. The most valuable thing I gained from that experience was not proving someone wrong. It was learning that the strongest communities are built when people understand the limits of power. Months after the situation with my property was resolved, I noticed something interesting about Pine Ridge Valley. The biggest change was not the new procedures. It was the way people started thinking. Before everything happened, many homeowners viewed the HOA as something distant. A group of people who created rules and handled decisions. Most residents followed those rules without asking too many questions. Not because they were afraid, but because they assumed the system was working exactly as it should. And when people assume something is working, they rarely stop to examine it. That was what changed. People started paying attention. They started reading documents. They started asking where rules came from. They started understanding that being part of a community did not mean giving up ownership rights. I saw that change during a neighborhood discussion a few months later. A homeowner brought up a question about a landscaping requirement. In the past, many people would have simply accepted the answer from the HOA. This time, someone asked for the written policy. Another resident asked whether the rule applied to every property. Someone else asked how the decision was originally made. The conversation was respectful. Nobody was attacking the HOA. Nobody was trying to create conflict. They were simply asking for clarity. And that was the difference. Questions were no longer seen as challenges. They were seen as part of a healthy community. I think that was the lesson everyone needed to learn. A good organization does not fear questions. It welcomes them. Because questions create understanding. They prevent mistakes. They make sure decisions are based on facts instead of assumptions. Looking back at the day Lauren Whitaker stood outside my gate, I remember how certain she seemed. She believed the HOA had authority because everyone around her accepted that idea. But confidence does not create jurisdiction. A position does not create ownership. And a title does not automatically create power over something that belongs to someone else. The documents prove that. The records prove that. But more importantly, the experience proved something about human behavior. People often respect authority without asking where it comes from. That is not always wrong. Society depends on people trusting systems. But trust should always exist alongside awareness. Because any system, no matter how well-intentioned, can make mistakes. The difference is whether people are willing to recognize those mistakes. Lauren eventually became someone who understood that. She did not stop caring about Pine Ridge Valley. She did not stop wanting the neighborhood to remain organized. But she learned that leadership requires listening. It requires patience. And it requires understanding that the people affected by decisions deserve a voice. That was the real transformation. Not just for her. For everyone. The HOA became more careful. The residents became more involved. And the relationship between homeowners and leadership became stronger. Not because there were more rules, but because there was more respect. When I think about my property now, I do not remember the frustration first. I remember the lesson. That gate where Lauren stood was never just a physical entrance. It represented a boundary. A reminder that every person has spaces, rights, and decisions that belong to them. Respecting those boundaries is what allows communities to work. Without respect, authority becomes control. Without accountability, leadership becomes assumption. But with both, something better is possible. A community where people do not simply follow rules. They understand them. And that is the difference between being managed and being respected. I used to think justice meant winning an argument. But I learned that true justice is when the truth changes the way people think long after the argument is over. After everything that happened at Pine Ridge Valley, my property remained the same. The gate was still there. The land was still mine. The quiet mornings and open space still felt exactly the same as they did before the HOA officers arrived. But the meaning behind that gate had changed. Before that day, it was simply an entrance, a way to reach my property. Afterward, it became a reminder that boundaries exist for a reason. A reminder that ownership is not just a word written on paper. It is a responsibility. It is a right. And it deserves to be respected. When I first purchased the land, I never imagined that I would have to prove something so basic. I never thought I would stand across from HOA officers and explain why they could not enter property they did not control. But that experience showed me something important. Many conflicts do not begin because people want to cause problems. They begin because people misunderstand where their authority ends. Lauren Whitaker was not someone who woke up one morning planning to create a dispute. She believed she was doing her job. She believed she was protecting the community. The problem was that she never stopped to verify whether her assumptions matched reality. And that was the mistake. Not caring about the neighborhood. Not wanting order. The mistake was believing responsibility gave her permission. Over time, I watched the changes at Pine Ridge Valley continue. The HOA became more careful about reviewing documents before making decisions. Board members started asking more questions. Residents became more involved in discussions. The community became less focused on simply following instructions and more focused on understanding them. That was a positive change. Because rules are strongest when people understand why they exist. Not when people follow them only because someone with authority tells them to. One afternoon, I stood outside my gate and remembered the first conversation with Lauren. I remembered her confidence. I remembered the way she spoke as if the outcome was already decided. At that moment, She believed the gate was something she could open because of her position. But she learned something different. A position can create responsibility. It can create expectations. It can create influence. But it cannot create rights that do not exist. That lesson extended beyond Pine Ridge Valley. It applies everywhere. In neighborhoods, in organizations, in workplaces, any place where one person has some level of authority over others. Authority must always have limits. Without limits, leadership can become control. Without accountability, confidence can become assumption. And without respect, even good intentions can create unnecessary conflict. I never wanted the HOA to fail. I never wanted anyone to lose their role. All I wanted was simple. Respect the boundary. Respect the documents. Respect the fact that my property belonged to me. And in the end, that was exactly what happened. The truth did not need anger. It did not need revenge. It only needed to be presented clearly. The records were there. The facts were there. The answer was there from the beginning. The HOA officers arrived believing they had authority over my property. They left understanding that they never did. And that was the moment everything changed. Not because someone was defeated, but because everyone finally understood the difference between having a position and having a right. Today, when I look across my land, I do not think about the confrontation first. I think about the lesson. A community is strongest when people respect each other. An organization is strongest when it accepts accountability. And a person is strongest when they can stand calmly, protect what belongs to them, and let the truth do the talking. The day I closed my gate on the HOA officers, I thought I was protecting a piece of land. I never realized I was protecting a principle that every homeowner deserves to understand. Looking back now, I see that the confrontation at Pine Ridge Valley was never really about one inspection request. It was never only about Lauren Whitaker standing outside my property. It was never only about a disagreement between a homeowner and an HOA. It was about something much bigger. It was about what happens when people confuse responsibility with control. When I first saw those vehicles arrive at my gate, I had no idea how much that moment would change the way our entire community viewed authority. At the time, all I knew was simple. I owned my property. I had the documents. I had the records. And I had the right to decide who entered my land. That should have been enough. But sometimes, the simplest truths become the ones people forget. After everything happened, I spent a lot of time thinking about what I could have done differently. I could have reacted with anger. I could have turned the situation into a public argument. I could have tried to embarrass the HOA officers in front of the community. But none of those things would have solved the real problem. The solution was never making someone look powerless. The solution was making sure everyone understood where power actually came from. And that was the lesson Pine Ridge Valley learned. Authority is not created by confidence. It is not created by a title. It is not created because someone says they have the right to do something. Authority comes from facts. It comes from legal documents. It comes from respect. That is why the outcome mattered so much. The HOA did not disappear. The community did not fall apart. Lauren did not become some enemy everyone wanted to defeat. Instead, something better happened. People became more aware. Residents started asking questions. The HOA became more careful. And everyone gained a clearer understanding of the relationship between leadership and ownership. A few months after everything happened, I stood outside my gate again. The same gate where Lauren had once asked me for access. The same place where she believed the HOA had control. But this time, everything felt different. The gate was not a symbol of conflict anymore. It was a reminder that boundaries exist because they protect people. They protect privacy. They protect ownership. They protect the trust that allows communities to function. I still believe HOAs can serve an important purpose. A well-managed community benefits everyone. Shared spaces need care. Common rules can create stability. But those rules should never replace personal rights. An organization created to support homeowners should never make homeowners feel powerless. That is the balance every community needs. And that is what Pine Ridge Valley finally understood. The most important thing I gained from this experience was not proving that I was right. The most important thing was seeing an entire community recognize why the truth mattered. Because anyone can claim authority. Anyone can speak with confidence. Anyone can believe they are justified. But eventually, the facts always arrive. And when they do, the truth does not need to raise its voice. It simply stands there, clear, documented, impossible to ignore. My property remained mine. My boundaries remained respected. And the lesson remained with everyone who witnessed what happened. A title does not create ownership. A position does not create permission. And real authority will always belong to the person standing with the facts.